Welcome to the NCS4 Research Seminar Series. I am Brandon Allen, Director of Research for NCS4 and Associate Teaching Professor of Sport Management at the University of Southern Mississippi. I am honored to present Dr. Bagwell as our presenter for this seminar. Dr. Bagwell has just finished his Ph.D. in sociology at the University of Miami under the direction of Dr. Alex Picaro. He is originally from California, in which he attended Cal State Fullerton for both the undergraduate and his master's degree. Dr. Bagwell presents his current research on the spatial patterning of crime during game days. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Bagwell. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Allen, for that brilliant introduction. And also thank you, NCS4, for having me a part of this research seminar series. It's fantastic. I'm really excited to get to share some of the work that I've been working on, both from my dissertation and some from previous studies I've been doing with Dr. Alex Picaro, some co-authors. So the topic of today's seminar is going to be the spatial patterning of crime on game days. Comparing downtown and suburban stadiums, kind of get an idea of the different spatial patternings depending on the location of the stadium. As Dr. Allen said, I'm Brian Bagwell, and I'm from the University of Miami. So kind of what I want us to think about is the research that's currently been done on crime in sports most comes down to the fact that there's an increase of crime in and around the stadium on game days. It's pretty consistent between the literature. But the other side of things is a lot of those relationships aren't consistent all the time. And so kind of what this wants to look at and kind of bore out is, okay, so what are some of these inconsistencies that we see across contexts between cities and locations of where stadiums are, right? So especially as we're thinking about the two locations that we're going to look at, is the impact of the physical location of the stadium or arena on the spatial patterning of crime in and around the stadium on game day. So where are things happening depending on where that stadium is located is one part of things. The second aspect is really addressing how do fans get to the stadium? And what is the flow from one place to another? How do they get there? Is there public transportation? Is it only via a automobile? Like, what are the different functions and ways? And so these are really two factors I want to hit on for how we can think about safety as far as the stadium and arenas go, and how these two different contexts and how changes along these lines can affect where crime may be happening in and around game days. So to do that, and I'm going to give a brief overview on this, and just so you can kind of get an idea of the maps that you're going to see in the next two slides, is really an overview of the methodological choices that were made here and kind of what they can do. So these two different results that I'm going to show you are both based on the same method, which is called hotspot analysis. And what this does is it's going to show clusters of elevated values together. So in this case, these are looking at about a 2-block radius, and it's going to compare where those clusters are coming together, and there's high elevated values near each other. And so those values are going to typically be in red if they're higher, and there's going to be no color if there's really no difference between all of those, right? So again, kind of when you're looking at these maps, red means that there's going to be a cluster of high crime values in those locations. And then no color is going to be at about the same regardless, right? So we're going to start first with the Suburban Stadium. So in this case, what you see on the left are days with no sporting events at the arena currently. So what you'll very quickly notice is that when the stadium is not in use, there is no red right in the location of the stadium. Which makes sense. Again, it's not in use, so it's not being used, and so there's no fans currently at the stadium. So one of the things to keep in mind about the location of this particular stadium is that there's really nothing around it. It's very isolated from the rest of the city. There are no businesses and bars and restaurants near this location. And so there's no reason to have elevated crime when the stadium is not in use. And so what we see is the largest area of a hotspot is when we see the largest red spot is going to be in and around two areas where the downtown area is, and then especially where there's a tourist area connected to downtown, here that we see a large concentration of crime in and around those areas. And this again makes sense. There's going to be people there, so more likely to have crime. And when we turn to the results for days that there are sporting events and the stadium is in use, what we also see is that there is no increase in crime in and around the stadium either. So on days that both the stadium is in use and the stadium is not in use, they're the same as far as there's no spatial clustering or there's no hotspot in those locations that is going to be elevated when the stadium is in use. But we do also see is that in those downtown areas, those hotspots actually get larger and grow both on the north side, on the east, going up north, and in the middle as well. And so this is very interesting because we typically like to think that when we have sporting events, that it's always going to be in and around the stadium that's going to be the increase. But what we see, especially with things like this city, that the downtown area may actually also increase when the sporting stadium is in use. And again, this is in the context of more of a suburban stadium that's very much more isolated from the downtown area and things like that. The other interesting thing about this context is that there is no public transportation to get to the stadium. And so really, fans only have one option to get to the stadium, and that is a vehicle to the stadium. Like I said, it's very isolated as well. So that's a couple of the contexts of what we're really thinking about is like partially this is location and isolation, but another side of it is also how are people getting there, right? And while I'm here, I'd like to thank my co-authors, Wanda Leal, Roy Shirasani, and Dr. Alex Beccaro and Christina Block. We work together on this project, so I want to make sure they also get credit for doing this too. And so this is one of the interesting things that we found that was kind of contradictory to some of the previous research that we had seen on crime in and around the stadium, right? So next, we're going to turn over to the downtown stadium. And what we see are very, very different from what we see in the previous results with the suburban stadium. And here on the left are, again, days with no game days and no stadium use. And what we see is, again, kind of similar where the downtown is the highest concentration, mostly red. And then there's a lot of pathways out from downtown that we see some spatial clustering of crime, especially along Sweet Auburn, going up to Beltline East and Inman Park, and some of these places that get you to downtown and along those cases. But what we do see is there's really only a concentration of crime in and around the stadium, south of the stadium. And this is really where the stadium connects to downtown, which makes sense that this is the most easy walkable part. And it's also where there's a lot more public transportation in this area as well. But in general, especially to the east of the stadium, and this is where a lot of the parking facilities are, and there's a bus stop and a MARTA stop here. There is no hotspot of crime in that area to the east of the stadium when the stadium is not in use. Versus we look at the results on the right, which are home games from 2017 to 2022, we do see a spatial clustering or a hotspot of crime directly in the immediate vicinity of the stadium. And there's a couple of reasons for this, and I talked about two of them already. So part of it is this is where the parking facilities are primarily located for this stadium, but it's also where the public transportation is as well. So they have some public transportation on the west side and on the east side of the stadium, both when it comes to subways, busing, and like I said, for automobiles as well. But the other difference is that there's also pathways to the stadium from downtown. And so fans can choose to go to downtown and then walk into the stadium versus when we were thinking about that suburban stadium, that wasn't a possibility, right? Because no matter what, they had to drive to the stadium. And so this is one of the clear ideas, and what we're really starting to think about is these different situations for stadiums, how we maybe need to rethink some of the security measures and things that we're doing versus these two different contexts between suburban and downtown, because they are very different the way that they need to be, the way that we need to utilize resources during these days to best fit what's actually happening on the ground and to make sure that fans are safe, right? But that's the key between these two. So Suburban Stadium is very isolated, only so many ways to get there, versus our downtown stadium. There are many ways to get there, much more prominent as far as people walking on pathways to get to the stadium and public transportation to the stadium and in and around for those stops, right? So that takes us to really the implications of what we can think about this being, and how we can utilize some of these results that we're seeing both on the spatial side and from some other research. But really, I think we need to take seriously these two ideas, and that's number one, the location of the stadium or the arena in the physical city is going to have an impact on how you need to secure that facility for fans, because it will shift the way fundamentally that fans are connected to the stadium, but also how the stadium is connected to the rest of the city. Because that relationship is very, very important, especially when we think about having more stadiums downtown, which really from this, if you think you're going to move your stadium in, there are changes that you may need to make to facilitate that, right? And that's really where this kind of comes in. Is like, okay, where is it physically situated in the city, and what influences, number one, the city having on the stadium, but what influences the stadium having on the city and how people get there, right? And I think the other part of that is how are fans actually getting to the stadium? And these various methods are going to determine where we utilize resources, and gets into that last point, especially when we're dealing with various types, automobiles, foot traffic, buses, and subways. Those are all different things that need to be accounted for to actually get to the stadium. And I think this is really the benefit of the spatial patterning and looking at geographically where crime is happening, is then we can best utilize resources and partnerships to facilitate these movement of people, to make sure we're utilizing all resources efficiently where they can be best implemented, right? And so that's kind of the key for this research, is spatially, where should police officers be? Where should security be? And kind of helps facilitate some of that conversation, and about using those resources to the optimal ability to make sure fans are safe during games. And that is it. Thank you so much for listening to this conversation. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Like I said, my name is Ryan Bagwell. I'm from the University of Miami. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bagwell, for your insight and research on the spatial patterning of crime during game days. It is interesting to see the differences between a stadium in downtown and as compared to a rural area, specifically when it comes to looking at public transportation and pathways to other commercialized locations in the surrounding areas. So I think that's great insight, and that will help event managers plan whenever they look at where they want to place a stadium or move a team into the general area, to take those into consideration. So we really appreciate you coming on and presenting this for us, and hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.